Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture, we're going to learn about non-conditional operators. These are two operators that help simplify your code by eliminating the need to do some null checks. Now, this is actually something that we already used in the events lecture. If you remember, for events, before you invoke the event, before that you need to test whether the event is null or not. Otherwise, it will throw a null reference exception if there are no listeners. And the compact way that I showed you for doing a null check is with this question mark. This is what is called a non-conditional operator. And basically the code is executed from left to right. So when the code reaches the question mark, at that point it checks the left side. If this left side is null, if so, then this instruction terminates right here and just moves on to the next one. However, if the left side is not null, then it continues executing onto the right side as if this question mark was not here. So basically the question mark, this does a null check at this point. And on the right side, you can write any code with the safe assumption that the thing on the left side is not null. Also, when I say that the instruction terminates here if it is null, what that means is that this whole thing gets evaluated into null. So for example, up here, if we do a console.writeLine, let's do a function to print something. So a public string, get player name, and let's just return a string. So something like this. And up here, let's just construct a player. So player, and actually let's leave it in null. And now we do player, then the question mark, and then get player name. So if player is set, if so, then it's going to return the player name. But if the player is not set, then this whole thing is going to evaluate into null. So if we run this, if there we go, it's empty, meaning that it's actually null. So we can test and verify equals null. And if that is indeed true, so if the left side is null, then this whole thing evaluates into null. Whereas if this one is not null, so over here, let's just construct a brand new player. So this one is not null. If so, then yep, it runs the entire thing and calls the function. And by the way, like we saw here, you can call any function after the question mark. So the standard that I showed you for the events is using .invoke, but that's just a event-specific thing. However, the question mark, the non-conditional operator, this one is not limited to just events. So as you can see, it works over here for the get player name and also works for fields. So over here, if we have a string player name, if we have this, and up here we can call the same thing, dot player name, yep, just like this. So basically it's only going to access this field if the left side is not null. And also you can have multiple of these in a single line. You can chain them together. So for example, if the player, if over here it had some kind of player for another target, if so, then you could do player question mark in order to make sure it only runs if not null, target, another question mark to make sure that it runs if it is not null, and then call take damage. Over here, pretty much the same rules apply. So basically, as it gets to this question mark, it checks the player. If the player is null, then it terminates the whole thing with null. But if it is not null, continues running the right side, and then it gets to this question mark and checks the left side. So if the player.target, if that one is null, if so, then again, it terminates over there. But if it is not null, then it's going to call take damage on the player.target. So the same rules always apply regardless of how many non-conditional checks you have. Now the second non-conditional operator is pretty much the same, except it's for index accessing. So for example, if we have a list of strings for some kind of player name list, if we have this, we can do, for example, player name list, do a question mark, and then the square brackets to access on some kind of index like this. So let's do a console.writeLine on this. And here the same thing will happen. So if the list is set to null, if so, then when it gets to here, it's going to stop evaluating. Whereas if this one is not null, so if it has something like, for example, let's say just one element, if so, then yep, it is going to go inside the list and grab it on this index. Like this does print Code Monkey. And of course, you can combine both of them. So you can combine the one accessing strings and the one just accessing properties and fields. So instead of a list of player names, let's do over here a list of type player. So player list, and we have a new one. And over here, let's construct a brand new player. So now on this, we can go inside the player list. We can do the question mark and then the index, access on index 0, then do another question mark and call some kind of take damage function. So it checks the player list. If it is not null, continues running to the right side. It checks the one on index 0. If it is not null, continues running to the right side and runs the take damage function. So if over here, this element on 0, if this one is null, then it would safely stop the execution right here. However, this will still throw an error if the index 0 is out of range, so do be aware of that. And since the whole point of this whole operator is doing null check, it can only work on nullable types like reference types. So if we put, for example, int I and set this something, then I question mark dot compare to, nope, this is not valid. The question mark operator, so the non-conditional operator, this one cannot be applied to an int. Again, that's because int is a value type, so it cannot be null. However, if we make this into a nullable, so we add the little question mark, if so, then this does now work. So we can call toString, yep, this works. If you don't know this syntax, this is nullables, and I'm going to cover nullables in a lecture later on in this advanced section. Alright, so that's the two non-conditional operators. Quite useful for very easily doing some null checks, and especially useful for making your event invocation much more compact without sacrificing readability.